Good day. This is Keith Johnson, Purdue University Forage Extension Specialist, and we're out here on a beautiful, beautiful fall day in Indiana. But something happened about 3 nights ago that caused a concern to a forage that we grow, sorghum and sorghum Sudan grass and Sudan grass, that we're going to talk about today. With me is Shelby Gruss. She is a PhD agronomy candidate at Purdue University, and her research focuses on a compound in sorghums called durin or prussic acid. Exactly, Shelby, what is prussic acid?
So prussic acid, as commonly known also as hydrogen cyanide, is a toxic compound that can cause acute poisoning in animals. It's found in sorghum Sudan grasses, as Keith has mentioned here, and it basically doesn't allow the animal to utilize oxygen. So oxygen goes into its red blood cells, but it does not get dispersed throughout the body, so it's being held onto. And so animals basically over time, actually this can happen quite quickly, suffocate in a sense.
Okay, so not a happy ending if prussic acid happens in tissue. So this release of prussic acid can occur in an event like extreme drought, or I mentioned the weather event a few days ago, freezing temperatures.
Yes.
And that's the concern. And I've told you, Shelby, that I can almost tell you from county to county when a temperature gets to 32 degrees or less with the number of calls I get about this particular concern. So what are the factors that affect the prussic acid poisoning? I mentioned the environmental factors of dry weather to the extreme and this freezing that we get, every year as being a kind of a problem that we have.
So there's quite a few different factors that can affect this. One of them is species, Johnson grass and Sudan grass as well can have this problem, but then also maturity. Generally, when plants are quite small, kind of similar to this, they have a lot of that compound that Keith mentioned called durin. And so when durin's broken down, it releases prussic acid in high concentrations. So small tillers like this and small plants can actually have really high concentrations of it, which could be very dangerous to your animals. But as it grows, it dissipates into less and less until it's basically at a safer height where the animal can eat it and not be as concerned. Unfortunately, this plant is has frost damage occurred to it, and frost can also cause issues with increasing concentrations of durin as well, as Keith was mentioning. And a lot of this can be caused by the new growth that's occurring. So generally, durin is concentrated within the leaves at the highest concentration, and then the stems have a little bit less and the roots less. But when new growth occurs, that's where most of that concentration is occurring at, and so new growth after frost can cause that. And especially when you have a killing frost and then you have a lot of new tillers coming in, you need to be really careful about feeding your animals that crop.
You mentioned Johnson grass. I actually had a call a couple of days ago, Shelby, about an individual that had Johnson grass, which is a member of the sorghum family, in his pastures, and he was concerned about the effect. And so you're exactly right. It may be things that we can purchase that are annuals like the sorghum family, but we also have that perennial Johnson grass that is in some of our grass pastures that we need to be aware of this time of year. There's no doubt about that. So what is the most concerning method of utilization? I mean, we can take this sorghum and do different things with it. We can do pasturing by livestock. We can make it into a hay crop. We can make silage out of it. Which of these areas is the most concern?
So the most concerning is when you use it as a pasture. This is directly, there's no breakdown of durin. It's fully held in that plant at that time, where it's thought when you ensile it or you cut it as a hay that this concentration can decrease over time. But I would still say be careful when you're using it as a hay. You are drying this plant down, so if there is durin content there, you're concentrating it more by taking out that moisture. And so, but ensiling is probably one of the safer options, where I believe it's up to 75% decrease when you ensile it. So most likely, as long as the plants aren't super small, which you probably aren't ensiling it when they're that small anyways, you're decreasing that concentration to very safe levels.
Okay, so again, pasturing, and the other thing is not much of this happens nowadays, but individuals could go out to the field and green chop.
Yes.
And that would be more concerning than making hay or making silage out of it.
Yeah, I would say so, yes.
Okay, very good. Are there laboratories available to producers that can test for prussic acid?
There are laboratories available. I do not know them offhand, but I believe that a couple out west definitely will be, you can send it in to test it. There are laboratory tests that can be done for that.
Okay, very good, but not a real common practice lab to lab, that's certainly for sure.
Not from lab to lab, it's not very common.
So the management of this crop is extremely important to follow, and so the timeline regarding pasture use then, you know, I was in Nebraska as a young man, and we grazed grain sorghum residues all the time, but my recollection is by the time we started grazing that if there were tillers or green vegetation, it no longer was green, it was totally dead and had probably been frozen a series of times. Is that a concern then after several freezes have occurred to be grazing this pasture?
As long as there's no new regrowth, you should be okay. That dead material should have broken down a lot, and Durin and prussic acid should have already been released. But if you do have that new regrowth, then I would start to be concerned, especially when there's high concentrations of that regrowth.
All right, so it's very, very important to not just look at your height, but to get down and to see if those young tillers are within that canopy, because as you showed, there's some very small tillers there that are 4 to 6 inches tall that we could find that we'd have a situation if we didn't look carefully. They could be there and they could pose a problem if they're still green and growing. So what is the future recommendation that we really should give now that we've got a freeze this year, but as we look to the future, people that plant this great annual as a forage, what's your recommendation in terms of not worrying about prussic acid when an oncoming freeze is happening in the next day or two?
My future recommendation is hopefully there will be something on the market where Durin is not there anymore. It's actually part of what my research is about, that will be available, that there will be no Durin produced at that time. But you could always just take extra precautions, making sure that the plants are tall, they're mature, there's not a lot of young tillers in the ground, or basically around. Try to decrease that concentration. And if you do decide that you want to use this material that is basically been frosted, try ensiling it, something that will break down that Durin concentration. We are actually currently working with some varieties that do not contain any Durin at all, and we're working to put that on the market probably in the next 10 years.
So in conclusion, what I would suggest we do is to realize that sorghum does have this compound Durin that can release prussic acid in these extreme events, and to be very, very cautious about their utilization and follow the protocol that Shelby talked about in terms of right size, making sure that time has passed after the freeze has occurred. Look for those small tillers and be wise about its use, and things should go along quite well for you. But futuristically, I would suggest utilize this crop before the fear of freeze even happens. Thank you very much.